terribly interested in all practicing these forms of mysticism. And just to parse this out a bit, as to maybe jog your memory, the Hekkalot or Merkabah literature are a form of mysticism in which the mystic descends into the divine palaces, and they have to bypass all kinds of angelic guardians, and they have food, and they have to give them secret handshakes, and the Dakota rings, and not really the Dakota rings, all this kind of weird stuff. Descend through the we would now call a beatific vision. To say they are allowed to gaze upon the throne of God. In some of this literature, they're allowed to sit upon the throne of God, which I always imagine like when you were a little kid and you were sitting in the big kid chair, you would sit in like the big people like chair, and you'd be like real small sitting in a giant recliner. I kind of always imagine that's what it's like to sit in the throne of God. It's like a really worn out, like greedy recliner that's super comfortable. Like granddad said in years. That's what I imagine to be the throne of God. And you can sit in the throne of God, and sometimes you can be transformed into an angel. Why you want to do that, I don't know, but you could, right? And Enoch, of course, is the quintessential version of someone who, one of the books of Enoch is transformed into an angel. Alternatively, the nerd option, and the nerd option is math. And the nerd option includes gazing upon the divine body and measuring it, right? You measure it in this parasong Persian unit of 3.5 miles, and you're allowed to learn the secret to different parts of God. Left eyebrow, and right eyebrow, and left knee, all these things. And you're allowed to measure the parts of the divine body. And these numbers arguing against the Merkabah and the guide to the complex. That might be the target, at least, of some of his analysis in the guide to the complex. By the way, just to drive that home, if that's the case, I think Menachem Kellner makes a really great case that it is. That means the greatest work in all of the history of Jewish philosophy is a response to, right? It's downing, it's a reaction to Jewish mysticism. And I think that can't be underestimated and underplayed. I think that's incredibly important if it's true. And I happen to believe that it's true, at least to some degree. The other form of literature that we talked about, or mysticism, is Torah mysticism. The Prince of the Torah. This is a para-rabbinic. We think these guys may have been in rabbinic circles, maybe on the outside rabbinic circles, not quite the inner core, but maybe kind of the hipsters outside smoking cigarettes and the dive bar the rabbis hung out. These guys wanted to teach them rabbinic lore, laws, and secrets. the person that comes to you, the day is a student and they see your notes, whatever. So 1 second, folks. No, okay, we're good, great. I just want to hear like 5 seconds randomly. It's better just to check and make sure I'm not in the wrong room or some other kind of mistake. Let's turn to now, as you might imagine, magic and Jewish more specifically present complex problems, right? They present a lot of complex problems. The first problem is that the term magic, concept of magic, is basically impossible. Scholars have been trying to pin down what exactly one means by magic for a couple of hundred years, maybe more than that. Really more than that. Because the problem with magic is, where does magic end and where does religion begin, right? It seems like magic is causing things by things. Well, what about prayer, right? Typical volume called Defining Magic. Here, right? Defining Magic. It's 260 pages of dense academic literature of about 30 or 40 different scholars trying to do just that. And guess what? They don't. They all agree that you can. So scholars, even that they're throwing ink at trying to figure out what that magic is, and it's a difficult task. What I'm going to say, right, is for the purposes of this currently, I'm just going to magic to mean any illicit supernatural practice, right? Any illicit supernatural practice. Now, why do I say illicit? Because magic has always been used as an othering someone else's practice. So, for instance, when the Greeks decided that they did religion, they othered the Persians. They said, the Magi, they do weird Persian religion. We do real religion. But those Persians, they do magic. Right? They are magic users. So, like, Catholic miracles, the Catholic Church, yeah, we do miracles. But what do we do with magic? It's witchcraft. So you can see here, right, that the lines we draw about what's magic and what's not, what's a miracle and what's not, what's sorcery and what's legitimate religion, the line has less to do with what you're doing. It has more with who control and who gets to decide what's allowed and what's not. So magic, in this case, is almost always an othering term. It's almost always used to describe what the other does. The bad people, the women, the Persians, the Jews. Whatever. So I just want to say that what I'm doing here is putting magic in a very specific way in order to elucidate how it operated within Judaism of course of several millennia. I am not offering a end-all, be-all definition of magic. It's much more fun. It's much more fun. Secondly, well, if the authorities determine what's in and what's illicit, well, the problem here is practices. Well, the Torah. Now, I know that you probably have in your mind the idea that the Torah condemns magic. And the answer to that is kinda. Kinda it does. It depends on what you mean by magic. So the most extensive condemnation that we see in the Torah of what we would now consider something like magic is actually probably in Deuteronomy 18. Now there are lots of other places in the Bible where magic or something like magic is condemned. There are practices or really people that do certain kinds of things that are condemned. But you'll see here, right? I've left the technical terms in the original Hebrew transliterator here. So it reads in Deuteronomy 18, there won't be found among you one who passes his son on the fire. This is probably an indigenous Canaanite practice. Right? Now, what you see here, right, is I've maintained all those Hebrew words in their transliterated form. Why? Because we don't know what any of them are, really. We don't know what they are. Divine thing cloud. So maybe it's one who clouds stuff, right? But what they do, we have no idea. A mechashef, right? This might come from the word right? Or snake, right? Right? This might about them when you don't know what they are. And so what we see, for instance, in Tractate Sanhedrin and the Babylonian Talmud is a very elaborate debate about what's allowed and what's not. What's supernatural causation that's allowed and what's supernatural causation which is awesome, which is forbidden. Of course, the most famous combination in the Hebrew Bible, that line causes thousands of people in the Middle Ages in the early modern period, specifically women. Female doing person, don't let them, right? That's and of course you probably know it more famously in the King James Bible translation, suffer not, right? That line thousands, tens of thousands of women to their death in the early modern period. That number is somewhere between 40 and 60,000 people, mostly women, were executed during the witch hunts. And that line is justified. They lean heavily on that line. Like it's so brief and so terribly profound. Of course, we have this line, Machashekel, by the way, you'll notice for folks who understand from Hebrew, it's in the feminine form, right? It's specifically targeting women. We do see other texts like Machashek, right? The masculine form of Deuteronomy, right? Deuteronomy. You can't let witches or female sorcerers or whatever live. Well, you can contrast it with other sections of the Hebrew Bible which seem perfectly at home with supernatural causation. The two most famous examples are divination. You're perfectly allowed to use divination in the Hebrew Bible. You have the specific form of divination divination. This is to say the breastplate of the high priest has a device in it called Urim and the Thummim, right? This is some kind of divination device, although exactly how it works, we don't know. There's a lot of speculation about this in the Talmud. When I say it worked, I mean, who knows what it really is. And of course, the other more infamous ritual is the Sotah ritual, in which a woman suspected of adultery, notice there's no male version of Sotah ritual, there's no men suspected of adultery or to endure this, in which a woman is forced to consume a broth made of sand, ash, and things that cause her stomach to become upset, and she would do the execution. So the Sotah ritual, right, is also a form of superstition to sort out whether or not a woman has committed adultery. So, ditto, like we find the Akkadian word for is that right? Right with the word shape right. Is it the exact same root word like the show right? Who's of course to Akkadian, then we have a very clear word for sorcerer, magic doer. This is important, by the way. Septuagint, of course, the Greek translation of the Bible, Hebrew Bible, into the Septuagint translates the word Makashekla, poisoner, pharmakeia, right? It translates it as poison. So they kind of translate it to make it a bit more rational, but it's very, very clear from original Hebrew, but the word does in fact indicate a specifically female magic. That's a really translation to get here. From the kid word teaching. Now, does the Torah give all magic? As we've seen, kind of. What do you mean by? You may remember this is lectures here on Jewish mysticism. This is the kids know, right? Many Israelites, at least one Israelite, had to consult with one of them. Right, monotheism is in your wheelhouse, and you're moving in the idea that there's a singular God who does everything in the world. Well, what is it? It's like Manasseh down the road, or Chava down the road, and they can like monkey around with reality and like people back to life. But church crops are making fun of each other. It seems like they have access to supernatural powers of your theological word. Where it's found. And that account, of course, to be found in the story of the Bahalat. Oh, you'll notice here, right? I have that reflection on consulting an oath back in Deuteronomy. We don't know her name. All is. It seems possible that this word is related to Av and maybe of ancestors, and therefore we might translate this word as something like the person who has access to the ancestors who are dead. Right? Now that's a really clunky translation. The typical translation was right, necromancy of the dead for various kinds of powers. Words specifically predict the future. That's exactly what we have here with the file. Oh, but we don't know what this word is, but I do think it's related to the word dead. These are special people that have access to those dead ancestors. So, you may know the story, right? Saul, first king of Israel, and it's going badly. Well, not only going badly, God has all the nation. Who means, I don't know, it's one of these people And he consults with this woman, so a woman character here. Or does successfully summon the ghost of Samuel, the Ruach of Samuel. And of course, like all prophets, they have bad news because prophets always had news. Never go to a prophet to get good. They don't got it. If you go to the prophet bank, you'll go to the good news section. The bad news is, yes. And guess what happens? In fact, you commit suicide dreadfully on the battlefield. So these are like narrative. There's no question. The text never said, and the mom was full of it, and she was a liar. And it paints her very, very nicely. She's always depicted as them, being very conscientious. She even says that when Saul doesn't want to do it, he has to force her to do it at some level. And she obliges him. So the Bible is nothing like the crooked nosed evil witch of Hansel and Gretel tales, right? Malevolent and preying upon people. Saul goes to her. She refuses. He insists. She summons the ghost. And then afterwards, when he's terrified of his impending fate, he tries to come to her own commissary, right? So the image of this term is described as the witch at Endor. I really don't like the translation witch at Endor because the term witch is so loaded in our imaginary that it summons an image of this woman utterly unlike how she's presented in the text. So I think we should call her what the text calls her. We should call her a Balao because it indicates that she's an expert, right? She's an expert at this, right? And clearly she is. Also, for my Star Wars fans, right, you'll recognize the name Endor. Andor in Hebrew, of course, becomes Endor in Star Wars, and there's a lot of weird Star Wars stuff in the Bible and Star Wars. So, so the Balad of Endor, it's very clear that the writer of these fat text in the Hebrew Bible clearly believes in the power of the Balad. We don't learn anything else about her. She comes into the story, she gets a few verses, and then she's anything else about her. At the same time, with all kinds of miracles, as you may remember, they're weird prophets from Babylon. It's a specific term for folks who are able to not only do prophecy but also do. And the only Hebrew Bible where the dead are resurrected are always in relationship to Elijah and Elisha. That's the only time in the Hebrew Bible. That's amazing because the dead being resurrected is a big deal. Because typically only God has power over life. Jump out alive. It's really spectacular. By the Second Temple period, Solomon, the son of King David, also magic, specifically the ability to control demons. Again, remember in the apocalyptic period, angels and demons kind of burst on in a way that they had previously in Israelite literature. And these demons, these sort of supernatural malevolent creatures, or at least Tiberi and also Josephus, first century. The Second Temple period was kind of jumping, hopping with weird dudes who could do miracles. You may know Coney the Circle Maker, right? He was famous as this is my partner, Rabbi Albert's famous Coney the Circle Maker. A great privilege of davening at his kever, his Galilee. He, as you may know, is infamous for forcing God to make it rain, but not make it rain a lot. Right? Coney said, "I'm going to stand in a circle, and God, I stand there until God makes it rain." Eventually, God made it rain. Punish Coney, made it a torrent, and Coney said, "That's too hard, God. Turn it down a notch." And God turned it down a notch and made it rain normally, and Coney left his circle. This almost led to the execution of Coney. The behavior with it. Coney was using powers to manipulate God. That's it. How cool is that? Of course, the other guy that we know about, Jesus, although I think calling him Josh, again, his name is Jewish Aramaic word for Joshua. Of course, Jesus also engaged in great deals of miracle making, predominantly exorcism. Jesus, if he were not known as the Messiah and the central core of Christianity, he may be known as a pretty famous Jewish exorcist. In fact, the majority of the miracles that he did involve exorcism. Another thing, Rabbi from this time period, of course, Mendoza. He was famous for a range of feats, including exorcism, teleporting, flying around. Yep, Mendoza, according to the Talmud, could teleport and fly around. He also engaged in nightly duels with the queen of the demons. The queen, we have a king as well. Lilith is the queen, the Ashkenaz king, depending on what text you look at. But Senator Mendoza was famous for all kinds of supernatural feats, including engaging with the Roman emperors, natural lines as well. She also mentioned Shimon Bar Yochai, the sacred Zohar, the central text of that in a few weeks. Shimon Bar Yochai also committed a great deal of miracles. My famous, of course, is that after hiding from the Romans in the cave for many years, he emerged disgusted with the piety of people around him, that lasers, fire, shot force and killed a bunch of people, so he retreated back into the cave. To wait it out. So we have something like Jewish Superman. So I don't know, maybe the laser or anything they learned later, no idea. I can believe that Superman's laser eyes are attributed to Shimon Bar Yochai, but I'm just gonna believe that. I'm just gonna go believe that they are derivative of Shimon Bar Yochai, but I don't think that's true. The image here, of course, is Jesus engaging in exorcism. His most famous famous exorcism. The Gerasenes, demoniac, who Jesus famous threw into a bunch of pigs and ran them off a cliff. There's a really great read of this exorcism ritual that I think is really important. Now, you might just say all this magic stuff is unique to a bunch of weirdos, like Jesus and those cats running around with him. No. Including things like abjuration, they're magical incantations to be used against various kinds of demons. All kinds of demons in the Talmud. The Talmud is full of demons. Specifics causing demons. There are massive lists and discussions in the Talmud where you are told you cannot drink pears. And if you why do we say in Aramaic not Hebrew? Well, I say demons don't understand Aramaic. So the demons will be invited into our house. They're food. Not kidding. That is a belief in Judaism about why we welcome into our home. You're interested in would be safer kids in Rabbbi. Now, all of that stuff I just mentioned is considered completely allowable in the Talmud. You can do astrology, you can make artificial humanoids, you can banish demons, kinds of stuff, right? There's a lot of things that look a lot like magic in the rabbinical imagination, but what's really clear is that not everything is allowed. For instance, we read in Pirkei Avot in the Mishnah, right? The more flesh, the more worms, the more possessions, the more worries, the more women, the more witchcraft, the more maidservants, the more untruths, the more death. Famous line from Pirkei Avot. Again, the more women, the more wives, the more witchcraft, the more misogynistic, but we also see here there's still a combination of witchcraft, right? Again, linked with women. Again, what we have here, right? What men do, what rabbis do, summoning demons and turning many things, that's okay. It's when women do stuff like that. Yeah, that's witchcraft. You see it? The othering, right? When men do it, yeah, we can get by. When women do it, it's witchcraft. And this again, here's an example of what seems to be patently a form of magic, right? This is from Tractate 18 of the Talmud. 18 has to do with divorce. The rabbis taught on coming from a bathroom, a man should have sex until he's waited for half a mile. Why? Because the bathroom is with him for that time. And if he does have sex, his children will let him. See? Not very good. If you go into the, by the way, the bathroom demon features prominently. Is it magic? Well, you don't do it till magic gets here. Looks like magic to me, right? I've done it after the time period of the apocalypse. Jewish magic really goes international. Let's say Jewish magic leaves Palestine, and there is going to go a little bit over. Hopefully, will forgive me. In the early common period, Jewish magic was Jews were associated with magic, and Jewish magic was heavily syncretistic, which is to say that Egyptian, Roman, Jewish, pagan elements were all muddled together to form a kind of international magical practice, international magical language. And an enormous amount of magic documents and magical devices are attested in the ancient world. These are gathered together in what is typically called the Greek magical diary, of which there are numerous examples of Jewish magic being practiced in the ancient world, both by Jews but also non-Jews using Hebrew or using Jewish names for God for their own magical purposes. Why? Because they thought the Jews and the Jewish God had some kind of special magical power. This is just a small gathering of some of the devices that are definitely associated with Jews that have survived from the ancient and late classical world. So you can see here we have love spells, right? You can cast this into a fire to form a love spell. You see a Difixiones, right? Difixiones is a curse tablet here written on in metal. Dead person. Incantations we have. I can pull it up for you later if you want to read the entire incantation. Incantations have been found throughout the ancient world. to the Kelsey Museum in Ann Arbor, you can see exactly. This is Ann Arbor at the Kelsey Museum. It's an excellent little museum there, but you can see this exact incantation bowl from my Michigan people. Get down, go to the Kelsey Museum, see the incantation bowl. You may notice here this is just a lot of wiggles. You're right, it's a bunch of wiggles, but it's wiggles that look like Hebrew. Vaguely. Well, not everyone can. So, read. But if you could read, you would get the real incantation bowl with the real incantation written around it. So we have these illiterate bowls, right, that are written with pseudo-script. And by the way, we can always tell who these are meant for because the Aramaic ones are always for Jews, the Mandean ones are the Mandeans, the other ones are for Christians or whatever. So everyone was using these. And there are thousands of these. If you get the chance to go to the Royal Ontario Museum in Toronto, they have one of the largest collections of these demon bowls in the world. They have a whole wall of them. So if you really want to get your demon bowls, go to the Royal Ontario Museum. I also say that one day if we ever do Tuesday arts and crafts with little kids, they should make bowls. It's like a completely authentic mummies. It's not making anything inside with monsters or whatever. It's a great way for them to put it under their beds, like deal with their fear of monsters. I feel like this is a particularly Jewish way of dealing with fears about demons by allowing those to make these bowls and maybe have a bit of catharsis and traffic the demons in the bowls. So, incantation bowls to just as a bit of wrapping up, let's only go through these a little more rapidly. Another text that begins to emerge at this time are exactly books of magic, right? Books we might call books of magic. One of the more famous, very early ones, is called Sacred Rabbis. Covered in depth 20-minute episode on my channel. So we have this in a book called the Sacred Rabbis that was recovered around the 8th, 9th, 10th century. We have magical symbols here. We'll see all throughout Jewish magic. To use this magic to get what you want, whether it's or whatever. The Sacred Rabbis has a spell for you, and it uses manipulate angels by using various kinds of magical symbols to get them to do what you want. The Sartor literature does similar. It allows you to rapidly explore. Here we're having it used to do a lot more wider things. Things like turning invisible and healing people, but also cursing people with it. Because it gets to be insulting sometimes. Another famous text from around the 10th century is the Chava de Moshe. This is an Arabic book that uses a section which are long strings of Hebrew or Aramaic letters. You would extract out of those long strings of Hebrew Aramaic letters. I've highlighted a section here that you would use for doing various things, and you would use those sections along with a magical spell. And those magical spells would empower those code words, and those code words would do all kinds of various things, like turning invisible and making people fall in love with you, cursing people and turning invisible, the same kinds of things that most magical spell books actually do. They're pretty repetitive once you get into them. So this one's interesting because the sword of Moses is that long random Hebrew letters, which are then extracted out and used for magical purposes that I mentioned earlier. So the sword is actually what is going on. Some of these magical words also show up later in Christian magical texts, which means that Christians were so interested in Jewish magic that they had the Jews translate some of it for them so that they could use the magical power as well, and then convict the Jews after killing them. But hey, history. Dangerous place. Another famous text how specifically to do magical certain kinds of days so that you can focus your magical power using astrology. astrology? Well, again, like quote, very frank, you can use this for the malbush, the garment, to do all kinds of magical things, and you write upon this garment with various kinds of magical names, names of God. And you fast these sort of things as well in order to enact the magical power. I think this image of device, but notice star. So that's fine. This is also in German. So horrifying. The most famous book of Jewish magic is the Sefer Rabbbi. The book of this is actually a collection of various books, including the Sefer Hamal, which is still printed to this day. I mean, right behind me. This book is actually printed in very, very tiny little edition, so you can carry it around in your house. And even the book itself is said to have magical powers even to this day. You're looking at an image here of some magical angelic script from the Sefer Raziel. These devices are meant to allow you either kamayot or amulets, which guarantee various things like success or defense from magical evil powers. So in here we have magical devices, and these magical symbols, by the way, date back all the way, some of them all the way to the Greek magical empire up to the first centuries of the Common Era. So this is a 2,000-year-long process of practice of Jewish magic. This famous edition was printed in 1701 in Amsterdam, all the way to this day. In fact, I have an entire copy printed on one piece of microfilm. Because the idea is, as long as you have a copy of the book, even if it's just a microfilm, then the book still has magical power. And I have an entire copy of microfilm downstairs with the scarring. So this book, we control things. And so here, again, we can see these magical. This idea of this magical script continues to be used all the way. It occurred most famously, of course, in the 30s edition of Cornelius Agrippa's 3 books of occult philosophy. And it continues to be reprinted in modern books of witchcraft, modern witches, and use these magical images all the way down to this day. Jewish magic is alive and well. If you go into Haredi bookstores, you will find books on Kameo. I can blend in. I go into bookstores and I look through the shelf. There are books of magic about how to make amulets, books of astrology, sacred in the Haredi world, magic is alive well today. Books being written. On magic, and the books are being practiced all the way down to now. It also survived in the instance, the Kohanim movement, as you may know, revivalists, quasi-Jewish revivalists, which is priests, pieces in that world, but also sort of being practiced as magic alive from the right. If you want to learn more about the history of the Kabbalah, those are both excellent texts to consult. Welcome back, and thank you for joining me as I explore the garden that is Jewish mystery. Commercials for a show in Ohio and Pittsburgh.